Thank you very much, and I'm pleased to be here. So let me just get the technology working here, always a challenge these days. So again, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here and join the chapter on your wonderful event. I've had the opportunity to attend most of the sessions over the last 3 days. You've done a fabulous job, so thank you. And my honor, and I realize I'm wrapping up the session, the conference, which is great, and I also am following Lee, which is going to be a tough act to follow, but no road trip stories for me. Before I proceed any further, I do have to just make a comment. As you may have seen from my bio, I am a director of the PMI Educational Foundation, and my colleagues from the Engagement Committee, Mr. Chandra, and our staff member, Leena Gupta in India, gave a wonderful update on the EF and all the exciting things that we are doing. So I'm very proud of that. I'm proud to be associated with it. However, for this presentation, I am not representing PMI EF. I am representing the thoughts of myself and on my company, NewGenP, which I'll be talking about. So, really exciting time we're living through right now, and very interesting with COVID-19 and everything that's going on. And I think it was so insightful of the chapter and the organizers for WAVES2020 decided to use resilient agile leadership as a topic for this particular presentation. So I'm going to try to do a little bit from sort of summarizing some of the things that I've heard and thought about. You know, one of the things that we always have a challenge with in these sessions is being the last speaker. Some of my thunder was stolen by earlier speakers, but I'll put a different spin on it, I think, and try to have a way to wrap things up for all of us as we get through this, the last session here. So let's start off with a definition of resilience. Right. So there are two I picked up from the Oxford Dictionary, and I'm actually going to talk about both of them. So the first is as a person to be able to withstand and recover quickly from difficult conditions. And certainly we'll talk about some examples, and at the second part about how we as individuals can help prepare ourselves to do a better job of recovering when we hit difficult conditions. The second is a substance or an object to be able to recoil and spring back into shape after being bending, stretching, or being compressed. And we're certainly seeing a lot of organizations that are being bent, compressed, and being stretched. We don't know if they're going to come back into their original shape or not. So let's start off in talking about organizations and some of the challenges that organizations are facing. So in the wonderful quiz that we've been running over the last couple of days, I was telling my wife this morning that routinely we're getting around 160, 180 people responding to the questions. And I started off this day in 206th position. I did manage to improve my position a little bit on today's score, but I'm still not doing very well. I think I got 5 out of the 25 questions right. So right up there with Lee. But in the questions, we talked about a couple of the companies that we were very big, well-known companies. Kodak, as this question mentioned, was valued as the 4th largest company in the world at one point in time, 20 plus years ago. Blockbuster, big company in the United States, and even here in Canada, where I'm from, and talking about Blockbuster. And these companies no longer are around. They're mere shells of themselves. But both of these companies, as the question talked about the Blockbuster history a little bit, Blockbuster had a business, whoops, getting ahead of myself here. Blockbuster had a model. They had a model of how they were going to rent out DVDs and VHS tapes and so on, but they weren't always thinking about how they added value to their customers and what their customers really wanted. And they charged late fees. So the fellow who founded Netflix charged late fees and thus put Blockbuster out of business, as they no longer exist today. We have similar ones with Kodak. As we talked about Kodak as a large company, the Kodak story was very similar. They invented the digital camera. Of all companies, they invented the digital camera back in the 1980s. And the problem was that they couldn't figure out how to make money with a digital camera because there was no film, no chemicals, no paper involved. So they tried to bury it. Well, they're getting some royalties from their invention now, but far cry from what ended up happening with photography and how it blossomed once we got away from things that made things very difficult for people to take pictures. We look at another large company in North America, Sears. They had been around for years. They had a mail order delivery business. They would send out catalogs to every homeowner in Canada and the United States. And from that catalog, we could look through the pictures, we could pick what we wanted to order, mail it in, and it would arrive in the mail to our door. Gee, isn't that what Amazon is doing today, except they're using the internet instead? Sears didn't figure it out. They didn't make the shift. A great Canadian company, BlackBerry, is synonymous with the smartphone, the introduction of the smartphone, right? Leading manufacturers of smartphones 10, 15 years ago. Then Apple introduced the iPhone. Where's BlackBerry now? Oh, they're still around, mere shell, their company, focusing more on the corporate market. And even Apple has had an interesting journey now, being one of the largest companies in the world. Microsoft had to bail them out about 20 years ago because they were going bankrupt. Microsoft needed Apple around to be competition, otherwise they'd be accused of having a monopoly. Shortly after Apple took Microsoft's money, they developed iTunes and the iPod, the iPad, the iPhone, and look where they are now. So companies that we're seeing are facing challenges. Some, like Apple, were able to be resilient and take the money and come up and reframe and be very successful. Others, like Kodak, Blockbuster, Sears, have not been able to, and the companies have ended up in bankruptcy and not existing right now. So these are all things of showing us why it's so important as organizations to think about being resilient. So one of the things I like to do, and I had the honor to speak at the chapter webinar about a month ago with my co-author of my book, NewGenP, Joanna Tivik, was to talk about this idea of the strategy implementation circle. When I was on the PMI board of directors, I noticed that organizations were struggling to implement strategy. And PMI quite correctly said that projects are the way companies implement strategy. That is, I believe now that's partly true, and Lee kind of mentioned in the last response to the last question, it is actually through products that you get to achieve the strategic objectives. Projects implement products, or projects deliver products, products deliver strategy. So if we think about the implementation cycle here, we have the idea of organizations come up with a strategy, come up with this path of where they want to go. From there, they're going to create strategic initiatives or projects by any other name to help achieve the objectives, those shorter-term objectives, shorter-term goals that were required to deliver a strategy. From projects, my keyboard seems to want to work on its own here. From projects, we will develop products where those are what will deliver value to customers. And we'll come back and talk a little bit more about value. Value will allow you to get feedback. Feedback from organization will tell whether you have achieved benefits or not. Benefits is what leads to strategy, achieving your strategic objectives. And the cycle goes along. One of the things that I think is important in today's world is this idea of getting the feedback and checking your benefits to see if you're achieving strategy. If we want to be resilient, if we want to understand what's going on, we have to look and get the feedback to find out what that is so that we can adjust to what the changing world is. Doing the same old thing day after day is no longer going to make a successful company. As we have seen from companies I talked about on the previous slide, some of the challenges that they've had. Okay, so let's just talk about a little bit of an example of how this map will work. There's a company found in Germany called InFarm, and they had this idea to build these urban farming of how we can make a sustainable future which is cost effective by creating urban farms as the land that we have is being used up for houses and for other uses. So in 2012, the founders of the company came up with this idea of what they call vertical farms. You can see an example of one here on the left. And the idea was they wanted to feed cities by bringing the farm closer to them. As a matter of fact, what they wanted to do was to install the farms in local stores, grocery stores, in Germany. So they wanted to get 100 farms installed in 3 years. Sorry, 100 farms installed in 100 stores in 3 years. So they were able to sign a contract with one of the larger grocery stores in Germany, an organization called Metro. So we now started a project to install these urban farms, these vertical farms in all the cities, in the Metro stores in Germany. Right? Their product that they were installing, as I showed, were these stackable modular farms, so you could have multiple units beside each other that were accessible. They gave so it became scalable. That were climate controlled, and they had an app that you could monitor the progress of the particular farm. The value they were going to be delivering to their customer, Metro, and to Metro's customers, the people buying food, well, to Metro stores, that they could monitor their farms remotely, so they didn't have to have someone watching all the time. If it became more popular, they could scale by adding more units. They gave them an access to a variety of different seeds to grow on the farm, so they could tailor the plants that they grew to what the local market, their customers in the stores wanted, and they would give their Metro's customers local food, food grown in the stores. So what was the feedback they got? Well, after, I think it was about 5 years, they were in 200 stores. They had 14,000 LinkedIn and Instagram followers. Interestingly enough, that 14,000 followers puts you, I believe it's in the top 10% for LinkedIn followers. And the benefit the company really received from this, based on this success, they got $100 million US in venture capital funding, which has allowed them to expand to, I believe it's about 20 different countries right now and still growing. Okay, so this idea of doing this implementation, implementing strategy and doing it as a cycle is important. One of the things that I argue in my book I published last year on Amazon is the idea that as organizations need to be successful and to deal with the challenges that are being faced, they have to use an iterative product lifecycle. So this is also a way to help organizations become more resilient, because they're in an idea of constantly thinking about changing and adding features to their products through projects to make them more successful. So you start off by thinking about a problem. What problem does your customer have? What does your customer need? Once you have that, you go into a market validation. You do this through a minimum viable product, trying to deliver the maximum value and features for the minimum cost to test the market, to see if the market will accept your product or not. Just as InFarm did, they produced a small product that they could test in Berlin in a local store to see if they could actually get value or not. Then the third step is you move into agile execution, an idea of using iterative steps to constantly add value to your product, add features to your product that adds value to the customers. We want to do this in order that we can stay competitive and keep current, so that we're in a cycle where we can deal with the challenges, the surprises, the things that are pushing and reshaping our product. We can deal with them on a constant basis. We have a team that's ready to go. We have people who are familiar with the product who can adapt to the changing needs. This way, the product can stay fresh. You know, there was an earlier speaker that talked about how the life cycle of products are shortening. My argument is, I believe that is correct. The products are failing at an alarmingly high rate, but my cycle is my point is, I believe many organizations are thinking about products being done at the end of a project, throwing it over to operations, and no one's worrying about it. Organizations need to put someone, a product manager, a product owner, worry about the product, constantly making sure it's refreshed to extend the product life cycle. Products that don't have new features added, that aren't keeping up to date to changes of regulations, will struggle and will not be successful. So let's look at a little example of how this can be done. I'm not sure how many people have heard of a company called Zappos. It's quite an interesting company. It was founded about 20 years ago. A fellow in New York City, or it was New York City, had the idea to sell shoes online. Now you think of who would want to buy shoes online? I mean, we got to go to the store, we got to test, we got to try them out, and so on. Well, he realized that people were really busy. It was hard for people to get to stores during normal store hours. So he thought he could sell them online. He'd get pictures of the shoes, put them up on a website, and he would then give a very easy way to return the shoes. If you tried them, you wore them, they didn't work, just send them back. Interestingly enough, because he wanted to use this idea of a minimum viable product, he didn't bother getting any arrangements with suppliers for shoes. He just went to the local shoe store and asked them if they would mind if he would buy shoes from their store and then sell them online. And they said, no problem. So that's what he did. So he created a website, shoesite.com, put up a website, put up pictures of shoes, people bought shoes, right? So he had his minimum viable product. They bought their shoes. This proved to him that the concept was successful. So after that, he started to expand the variety of shoes that he had. He started going to different stores. So that's another iteration. When business started to improve, he made arrangements with suppliers and got the shoes directly. And he just kept growing and growing his business. Ultimately, he ended up selling, I believe it was Amazon, made a lot of money. But it was this idea of continuously improving his product of the shoe company to continue to add value to his customers. So let's contrast this with some of the more traditional life cycles, which are struggling in today's age. So the top of this slide, I have the sort of traditional way you can think of making a car. Now, let me back up. Let's say we have a customer who has a problem. They want to be able to go from point A to point B. So if we jump in and say, oh, they need a car, and we're going to make them a car, if we follow the traditional cycle of developing a product, we'll start off by getting the wheels together, then we'll put the chassis on the car, then we'll put the body on the car, we'll finish the car off and send it off to the customer, and finally the customer has value that they can then go to use to drive from point A to point B. So in the time while we're trying to figure out how to put the car together, maybe not quite the Mercedes with the radio that only can electric clock at 60 miles an hour, putting the car together, the customer has nothing. They're sitting there waiting to get the product so they can go from A to B. On the other hand, if we step back and say the customer wants to go from point A to point B, we can start off by offering things that have less features but sooner. So we could offer them a skateboard. And the customer would say, oh, that's okay if I'm just going to go a couple of kilometers, but I've got 20 kilometers to go. This is not so great. And it's not so good if it's raining. So then we say, well, how about a bicycle? We could develop a bicycle for them. Well, that's not so bad if I'm going to go 20 kilometers. I could do that. But, you know, the hills are a little tough to do. Okay, well, let's put a motor on the bicycle and get a motorcycle. Well, okay, that's better. It's easier for the hills, but you know, the weather's bad. I'm in Toronto, Canada. We have winter here, it gets snowy and cold and ice. It's not so good. Okay, but at least now, you know, my customer can get from point A to point B on sunny client days. So then we have a car where we are able to now be enclosed and deal with the weather conditions. So the car is great. However, it's a little expensive for gas, so then we get an electric car. So each time we release the product, we're not only giving more value, but we're getting feedback from the customer that allows us to improve the product to what's important to them. So we never mentioned having a radio, so we don't put a radio in the car, right? Unless they say, oh, I'm now using the car for longer trips, I like to have a radio. Oh, we're getting the feedback we can have. So this is this idea of for companies to be resilient is to be able to understand, or for products to be resilient, is to be able to understand what value they're delivering and keep delivering the value. Okay, so we have this idea of products delivering value to customers. But in order for companies to be successful, they have to get feedback from customers. And they have to get feedback that is true feedback. I mean, customers are terrible at giving feedback. I had a company I formed a few years ago. We had a great product. We ran focus groups to get feedback from some people that we knew to see what they felt around the product. They said, oh, this is great, Peter, this is great. So we went ahead and started producing and offering the product, but no one bought it. So I had to come to the conclusion that my people I invited to look at the product told me it was great because they thought that's what I wanted to hear. I didn't want to hear if it was great if it wasn't great. That's what I wanted to hear. So, you know, ended up having to shut down that company, learned how to learn something there, but ended up shutting down that company, stopped product because no one bought it. It didn't add value to them. They didn't see the value. I believe it did add value, but we didn't communicate it well. But we needed the feedback, right? And the focus group didn't give us the feedback, but when we put the product to the marketplace, we certainly got the feedback as no one purchased it. So as we think about products in an organization, yes, we want to make sure we're doing this iterative development approach. So we're delivering value in a continuous way to our customers. But we also need to make sure that we are listening to our customers, that we're getting feedback, and feedback that represents as close as we can to the truth or the reality of what's going on. And one of the nice things that we have, of course, is using the internet, is we can get lots of great information about who's buying our products, where they're buying it, how they're buying it, and so on. It helps. One of the things that we do want to encourage you to think about as you get feedback is to use the 3 R's of feedback. So the first is when you get feedback, is try to relate to the feedback. Put yourself in the customer's shoes to walk in their shoes. Become a customer of yourself. If a customer is saying that the product is hard to buy, try buying your product and see what it's like. Put yourself in their shoes to see how it works. It's surprisingly how many organizations don't do that. They don't insist on their employees, their staff, the people supporting the products use their products. Second is reflect. Think about the situations that would trigger the feedback. So what caused the feedback? Think about what is your customer doing? What is happening? With tools such as working through a customer journey map to be able to understand where the customer is in the journey with your organization that would cause the feedback is so important. And lastly is reshape. So share what you've heard back to the customer. Share with them what you're going to do to address their problem. And then share what the status of that is and get their feedback on if they think your proposed solution will work and then if it does work or not. You need to be able to set this up as part of your product for your organization if you want to be able to be resilient, if you want to be able to be adapting or use business agility or the agile approach in order to be successful. Let's wrap up with a couple of slides just to talk about the first definition that we had of resilience, which is around people and around being ourselves to be resilient. A little bit of what Lee talked about in the last presentation is to think about yourself and think about how you can continue to develop as an individual and as a leader. As project managers, as professionals, we're all leaders in our organizations. We have to think about how can we be an effective leader? How can we lead our teams, our project teams, our management teams, our product teams, in order that we can grow and have the team grow. Now, you've probably all heard and been exposed to different styles of leadership. The current version of the PMBOK guide talks about 5 of them. Others will go to a lot of different types, so we can talk about the charismatic leader, the transformational leader, the transactional leader, the laissez-faire leader. But the one that I think that as project managers, and the one that I believe to help our organizations deal with resilience is the servant leader. So I picked this up from Caring Leaders by Larry Spears, talking about what the characteristics of servant leadership. And servant leadership focuses on the needs of others. So as an organization, if we want our staff members to become more resilient and we want to be able to adapt and deal with crises that come up, we need our teams to feel empowered, and we need them to feel that they can act on, they can act in the best interest of the company, not having to go to check with the boss to see what has to be done. I can remember back in the days when we were able to fly, I was down in Jacksonville, Florida, in the United States at the airport, and I was lining up at Starbucks to get something to eat on the plane, and I waited an abnormally long time in line. It was okay. I had my smartphone with me. By that time, I had abandoned BlackBerry like everyone else. I was just checking my emails. When I got to the, but it seemed to be an inordinately long time I was waiting in line. When I got to the cashier, ordered what I had to order, the cashier said, I went to pay, said, no, you waited too long in line, this is on us. No checking with the manager, nothing. This was an example in my mind of how Starbucks had both established a culture around customer satisfaction, but how they had developed servant leaders and empowered their team members to make decisions that were appropriate. Okay, so as a servant leader, you want to focus on the needs of others. You will do this by using the 10 techniques that we see here on the slide. We'll briefly, I'll talk more about some, briefly about some of the others. So one of the things servant leaders have to do is to be able to listen. So they have to listen effectively. And this is using this idea of active listening where you are engaged in a conversation. Hard to do. You're trying to tune everything out, just focus on the person that you're having the conversation with. And as the saying goes, that God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, we should be using things in conversations in that proportionality, listen more than we talk. We have to be able to develop a better job of empathy. And this goes back to what I talked about in the 3 R's, to be able to put ourselves in the shoes of the others and be able to understand where they're coming from. And this goes along with this idea of assuming best intent. We have to make sure that our team is healing, or is in this idea of having emotional health, of a wholeness of people. We're all going through a lot of changes with having to deal with COVID-19. We may have loved ones who are afflicted by the virus. Our plans may have changed. The way we work may have changed. Where we work has definitely changed. So we have to be able to be, along with empathy, be able to think about people's mental health. And certainly I've been very pleased that some employers have recognized that, have given people time off, extra time off, just so they can understand and deal with all the change that's going on. This is related to being aware of what's going on with people as well. You want to use persuasion as opposed to dictation or dictate, right? You don't want to tell people, you want them to understand why and empower them to be able to, and be able for them to understand how to move forward. This is, specifically, this is important if you're going to be having to try to react quickly to make your organization more resilient. Now, as a servant leader, we have to be able to conceptualize ideas and communicate them effectively. We need to see the foresight of where we need to be. So we talked about Stephen Covey about planning ahead, so we have to do that. We have to be able to steward our employees to allow them to grow, to acquire new skills, for them to become more valuable as employees and be able to contribute more to the organization. Show our commitment to their development. So it's about them developing skills, not about us. And finally, this idea of building a community or building a team so that we can get a group of people who start to trust each other and work together effectively to achieve a common goal of the organization to be successful. So part of going through this developing of organizations and dealing and team and servant leadership is being able to lead teams through change. So this is a very traditional change model that we've seen as people will start off with being shocked at why there has to be change, and then they go through the particular phases, denying the change, getting frustrated, getting depressed by the change, starting to test maybe this isn't so bad, making the decision to stay with change, and finally having it integrated into their overall life and the way that they will approach how they're going to go about doing their job in the future. So as a leader of a group, we have to help our team to go through change. We may also have to lead teams that are introducing change into organizations or into customers as well. But as a leader of a group, we've got to help our team go through the change. And we have to help understand these steps and be able to support them as they go through. Organizations that don't change, people who don't change and acquire new skills are not going to be successful. Right? As we've seen, organizations, Kodak invented digital photography, was denied that it would have changed the way the business was done, ended up in bankruptcy. So we need to be always prepared to be a change in place. And as I said, as a project manager, you, and any professional for that matter, you have to be prepared yourself for change and think about how to support those that you lead for change and support the organization to change. So just to finish off, Lee did mention Stephen Covey. I was very happy to see he stopped at the second habit because I had the seventh habit in place. So the seventh habit is sharpening the saw. So what Stephen Covey talks about in his 7 habits for highly effective people is the last one is to invest in yourself. So I've talked about, the things you want to do as a servant leader, but for you to do those, you need to make you the best person you possibly can. You need to continue to invest in yourself, to acquire new skills, to learn more about what is going on in this world, what is happening in this world, so that you can be sharp and be able to help your team. But you also need to worry about your own physical well-being and mental well-being as well, to take time to reflect on what's going on, to ensure that you have time to recharge your batteries so that you can be an effective leader and an effective person to help support your organization. I will end with one story. My wife has a very good friend, Joyce. Joyce is 90 years young. Joyce has not had the easiest life in her 90 years, but Joyce has made the best of her life, and she's living comfortably on her own with the support of her son and daughter who are here in the city, and a network of great friends who keep in touch with her, including my wife. And as Joyce is always interested in learning new things. I know it was a few years ago when we upgraded one of our computers, we donated the old one to Joyce. She used it, she loves it. She could talk to some of her siblings on Skype. She was always wanting to learn new things. So my wife was talking to her about how myself and my co-author Joanna Tivik had written a book around product ownership, and Joyce said, I want to read that. And I'm thinking, Joyce wants to read my book? Well, that's very flattering, but why? So we dropped off a copy for her to read, and she read it from cover to cover. My wife claims she hasn't read a book from cover to cover in like 50 years, but she read my book from cover to cover, and she was so excited, she called up Lynn and my wife and said, everyone should read this book. Just a minute. This is about product ownership and how that's important for organizations to be successful. It's a business book. But Joyce said to Lynn, we are all our own product. That we all have to own our product ourselves. We all have to invest in our product to ask ourselves, what features do we have that we can give value to others? Are we giving value to others or not? Are we getting feedback from our employer, from our family, to how we're adding value, society at large, how we're adding value, and what can we do to add more value, add more features, skills, and knowledge to add more value? So apparently I wrote a book about product ownership, which could be a book around self-growth as well, according to Joyce. But it's also remarkable to me to see this very fine woman who, is having her challenges at 90 physically, but still mentally very sharp, luckily, still wanting to learn and wanting to grow, wanting to keep sharpening her saw so that she can stay current and help support her family and her friends. So with that, that brings me to the end. So thank you very much. I've had been fortunate enough to travel to India a couple of times. So here's a picture of me in Mysore with a couple of Indian elephants. So very nice trip I did when I was in one of the times I was in Bangalore. So thank you very much for your time. Hopefully I have a few minutes for questions before we go into the ending of the conference.
Absolutely. Peter, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right. Thank you very much for this session. I think this was the perfect one to close off. It's like you've summarized what we're trying to achieve with this conference and all the things that we've learned over the last 3 days. I think it's perfectly put that in a very simple set of slides and given the right perspective for people to understand. From be it the strategy implementation circle, going from strategy to feedback and back to strategy, or the iterative examples of Inform and Zappos that you mentioned, and how real-life examples implemented that circle from feedback to strategy and back to feedback, and also about the 3 R's of relate, reflect, and reshape on the feedback. So I had a couple of questions. I'll just pose them to you on the feedback specifically, and then go down into the further questions. One question I got, or there are 2 questions related to feedback. Maybe I can pose both of them to you. Maybe they are related. The first one was, how long should the feedback window be in the strategy map for a startup organization? Is there any general rule? Did you get my question?
So how long should
the feedback window be in the strategy map for a startup organization?
Okay, so good question, and there's 2 sort of answers to that. So the first one is you want to get into a way of doing continuous feedback. So as a startup, you want to issue your MVP, get your MVP out, get feedback, take the feedback, adjust, right? So the value of the MVP is getting the feedback, not necessarily making money, right? So you want to keep going with that. Now, the second part of this, which is the dilemma I had with the product I mentioned, with around the example of not getting good feedback, was how long do you keep the cycle going of adding features or removing features to get getting feedback until you say, I got to make money, right? So how long do you keep going at that? And that is a tough question to answer, because we have companies like Uber, who I believe are still trying to make money, but are doing extremely well because they've been able to attract investors. And yet, in my case, with the product I had a partner, we had trouble figuring out what we should add next, so we killed it right away. So that becomes a much more nuanced discussion about a variety of situations. I mean, how much money do you have? How passionate are you about your product? What is the elements of the feedback you're getting? I mean, in the case of Uber, they may not be making money, but lots of us are using their services. So there's an element there. Eventually, they'll figure this out and get money back. So there's a number of nuances there. So it's hard to answer that one directly about how long should you wait. It depends. Right?
Okay, so it's also the way you look at value created, right? How you perceive value created. Is it the money or the features or your presence in the market?
That's true, and that's very true. So I mean, if you're tinkering with a product and you've got it on the side where you have money coming in, and so you don't need to use it to make to buy food and put a shelter over yourself, then you probably take longer than if you need it to make money right away. So,
right.
So it's a very good point what you mean for value as well. Thank you.
Okay, so that will be a segue into the next question. So there are some companies who have productized this feedback. You know, they go for the feedback rating to sustain market competition. So what would be your advice to such approaches?
Yeah, so feedback is really, really tough to get. So there are companies who are trying to take advantage of that to figure out and help you get feedback. But I will say it's hard to get. There is nothing better than to talk or watch a customer use your product. I would try as much as you can to avoid the middle person. They don't understand your product. They don't understand the problem of your customer or the need of your customer you're trying to solve. Do it yourself or do it from the staff in your company as much as you can. Now, having said that, there may be some of the work you can get done from outside companies. You know, as I'm exploring with Google Analytics and all this way of tracking stuff, it is extremely complex. And there may be people that can help you get some of the raw data for that. But they won't understand your product. I still think that is something as a bit of a secret sauce you want to keep internally. Use their tools, but you understand and interpret. Don't allow others to do so. I don't think others will always understand.
That's very important. Thank you very much. And I also, it was interesting to hear about servant leadership, especially in these times. And I came back from a workshop on servant leadership this week, so it resonated very well with me as well. But one question that I have on servant leadership is a lot of, as you know, in these times, a lot of businesses are going shut. And the existence of business and servant leadership, how do you, and ultimately the business has to exist in order to have a leadership and that to a servant leadership. So how do you connect both?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. It's one I think about. You know, everything that we hear and read, every person I've talked to wants to work for a servant leader. Yet, if we look at our companies, those people who are leaders in the company, we look at our political leaders, they're not servant leaders, right? They are transformational leaders, they're charismatic leaders, and sometimes they're transactional leaders where they're just, you know, telling us what to do, right? And yet these are the people we vote for. We don't vote for the servant leaders. We don't vote for that leader who wants to lead from behind to put the needs of others first. We want that person who will be up in front, leading the group and saying, here's where we're going to go, follow me. So we have this contradiction, and I'm not sure how we're going to resolve that. I mean, at one level, we're saying that's who we want to lead us. On the other level, I don't want to work for one of those people. I want to work for someone who's looking after my best interest. So it becomes a very interesting dichotomy, and I'm not going to give a direct answer. I'm going to be very interested to see how this resolves. I'm hoping that as we mature as organization and society, as the millennials start becoming much more in the workplace and take on leadership roles in the workplace, that they will start accepting and expecting much more leaders and organizations as servant leaders. That as organizations get flatter, as this larger span of controls, the only way those will work is with servant leadership styles. That we see more of that coming in place. I'm hoping that's what we're going to start seeing, and it will start filter through all aspects of our society. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing too much of that now, but we will see. There may be changes. Lots are changing right now.
Right. Well, I'll end that on a positive note, and then taking the positive note that you had struck in your session, that that perspective that your wife friend Joyce brought in, that we are our own products and we need to invest in ourselves. Hope as leaders we can invest in ourselves to make us resilient enough and be the servant leaders that we want to be, and we can resurrect, handhold, empower our teams to deliver better projects and better products. Thank you very much, Peter, for that session. Like I said at the beginning, what a wonderful session to end this conference with. So as a token, happy.
Thank you very much again. I really appreciate the opportunity.
You're very welcome. So as a token of appreciation, we are planting a tree along with Sanjay Saru in your name. There is a QR code that you can see on the screen. Scanning that, you can track the growth of the tree and through Google Maps. We are also thankful to you for supporting our UDAN program, where we will use your presence and your contribution to support children in need. So thank you very much for both.
Thank you very much. My father was a forester by training, and so having a tree planted is very, very touching. And thank you very much for the opportunity. Congratulations on a wonderful conference.
Thank you very much, Peter. And that's it from me. Over to you, Anna.